The wind cut through the Texas plains like a blade, and Pierce Crawford knew he was about to make a decision that would change everything. But he did not yet understand how profoundly it would alter the course of his life. It was January of 1882, and the cold snap had arrived unexpectedly, catching everyone in San Elizario off guard. Pierce had been riding back from a cattle drive to El Paso, his bones aching from 3 weeks in the saddle, when he spotted the figure huddled beside the road. At first, he thought it might be a discarded sack of grain, but as his mare drew closer, he realized it was a woman, her thin shawl doing nothing against the bitter wind that howled across the desert landscape. He pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the frozen ground with a crunch. The woman looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, her lips tinged blue with cold. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with dark hair that whipped around her face in the relentless wind. Her dress was torn at the hem, and she clutched a small carpet bag to her chest as though it contained everything she owned in the world. "Madam, are you hurt?" Pierce asked, kneeling beside her. He was 25, tall and broad-shouldered from years of hard work on the range, with sun-weathered skin and dark brown hair that curled at the edges beneath his hat. "I am just cold," she said, her voice trembling. "My stagecoach broke an axle 5 miles back. The driver told me to wait while he rode ahead for help, but that was hours ago. I thought I could walk to town, but the wind got worse." Pierce did not hesitate. He shrugged off his heavy sheepskin jacket, the one his father had given him before he died, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The cold immediately bit through his flannel shirt, but he ignored it. "You cannot stay out here. Can you stand?" She nodded, and he helped her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "My name is Pierce Crawford. I am going to take you into town. It is only about 3 miles from here." "Florence Sanders," she said through chattering teeth. "Thank you. I thought I might freeze to death out here." He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to keep her steady while he held the reins with the other. He could feel her shivering against him, and he urged the mare into a faster pace than he normally would have chosen on the icy ground. As they rode, Florence began to talk, perhaps to keep herself conscious, perhaps simply because the silence was too frightening. "I came from Missouri," she said. "I was supposed to be a school teacher in El Paso, but when I got off the stage in San Elizario to change coaches, there was a telegram waiting. The school burned down last week. They do not need a teacher anymore." "That is rough luck," Pierce said, genuinely sympathetic. "Do you have family back in Missouri?" "No," she said softly. "My parents died last year, cholera. I sold everything to afford the journey west. I thought I would have a fresh start." Pierce felt his heart clench with sympathy. He knew what it was like to be alone in the world. His own mother had died when he was young, and his father had passed 3 years ago, leaving him the small ranch outside San Elizario. It was not much, just 100 acres and a modest herd, but it was his. By the time they reached San Elizario, full dark had fallen, and Florence had stopped shivering quite so violently. The town was small, just a collection of adobe buildings clustered around a plaza, with a church at one end and a general store at the other. Pierce guided his horse to the boarding house run by Mrs. Elena Martinez, a kind widow who had been a friend of his father's. He helped Florence down from the horse and kept his arm around her as they climbed the steps to the front door. "Mrs. Martinez opened it before he could knock, her round face creasing with concern when she saw Florence's condition. "Dios mío, what happened?" she asked in her accented English. "Found her on the road," Pierce explained. "She needs a warm room and hot food, Mrs." Martinez ushered them inside immediately, clucking over Florence like a mother hen. "Come, come, I will draw a bath and make soup. You poor thing, you are frozen through." Pierce started to leave, but Florence caught his sleeve. "Your jacket," she said. "Let me give it back." "Keep it tonight," he said. "You need it more than I do. I will come by tomorrow to check on you." She looked at him with those storm-gray eyes, and something passed between them, some connection he could not quite name. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford. You saved my life." He touched the brim of his hat and left before she could see the color rising in his cheeks. As he rode back to his ranch in the freezing wind, he could not stop thinking about her, about the way she had felt in his arms on the horse, about the sadness and determination he had seen in her face. The next morning, Pierce woke early as always, did his chores, and then found himself riding back into town earlier than necessary. He told himself he needed supplies from the general store, but he knew the truth. He wanted to see Florence again, to make sure she was all right. He found her in the boarding house dining room, eating breakfast with Mrs. Martinez. His jacket was folded neatly on the chair beside her, and she looked much better than she had the night before. Her cheeks had color in them, and her hair was pinned up neatly. She wore the same dress, now cleaned and mended, and he noticed how pretty she was when she was not half frozen and terrified. "Mr. Crawford," she said, smiling when she saw him. "I was hoping you would come. I wanted to thank you properly and return your jacket." He sat down at the table, accepting the coffee Mrs. Martinez poured for him. "I am glad to see you looking better. Have you had a chance to think about what you will do now?" The smile faded from her face. "I need to find work. I have a little money left, enough for maybe 2 weeks of room and board, but then—" She trailed off, her hands wrapping around her coffee cup. "Can you read and write well?" Pierce asked. "Of course. I was trained as a teacher." "Can you do figures, keep books?" Florence nodded. "I am quite good at mathematics, actually." Pierce made a decision. "I need help at my ranch. I am not good with the bookkeeping side of things. My father always handled that, and since he died, I have been making a mess of it. If you could help me get my accounts in order, I could pay you." It would not be much, but it would be something. Mrs. Martinez's eyes lit up. "That is a wonderful idea, Pierce. And Florence, you could help me here in the afternoons with the other guests. I am getting too old to do everything myself. Between Pierce and me, we could make sure you have steady income." Florence looked between them, her eyes suddenly bright with tears. "You would do that for me. But you hardly know me." "You need help and we can provide it," Pierce said simply. "Seems straightforward to me." Over the next few weeks, Florence came out to Pierce's ranch 3 times a week to work on his books. She was good at it, better than he had expected. She found errors going back years, organized his receipts, and set up a proper system for tracking expenses and income. But more than that, she brought something to the ranch that had been missing since his father died. She brought life. She would arrive in mid-morning, usually getting a ride with one of the neighbors who passed by the boarding house on their way out of town. Pierce would set her up at the kitchen table with all his papers, and she would work while he did his chores. At noon, they would eat lunch together, and he found himself looking forward to those meals more than anything else in his week. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her parents and the little schoolhouse where her mother had taught before her. She talked about her dreams of teaching, of making a difference in children's lives. He told her about the ranch, about his plans to expand the herd, about the loneliness of the past 3 years. They did not talk about the way he found excuses to come inside more often when she was there, or the way she always seemed to have just made fresh coffee when he appeared. They did not talk about how their hands would brush when he handed her a document, or how the air seemed to crackle with something electric when they were in the same room. February turned into March, and the weather began to warm. Florence had become a fixture in Pierce's life, and he could not imagine his days without her anymore. She had not only organized his books, but had helped him plan his spring cattle purchases, showing him how he could expand his operation if he managed his resources carefully. She was smart and practical, and he found himself valuing her opinion on everything. One afternoon in late March, they were sitting on the porch after she had finished her work for the day. The sun was warm, and wildflowers were beginning to bloom across the prairie. Pierce had his jacket on the porch rail, the same one he had given her that freezing night in January. She had tried to return it several times, but he kept telling her to hold on to it, just in case another cold snap came through. "Pierce," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" "Anything," he said, turning to look at her. "Why did you help me that night? Most men would have ridden right past." He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "My father taught me that a man's worth is not measured by what he takes but by what he gives. And I suppose I know what it is like to feel alone in the world. I could not leave you there." She reached over and took his hand, and the touch sent electricity racing up his arm. "I think I was meant to be on that road that night," she said. "I think I was meant to meet you." Pierce turned his hand over so their fingers could intertwine. "Florence, I need to tell you something. These past 2 months, having you here, working with you, talking with you, it has been the happiest I have been in years. Maybe ever. I think I am falling in love with you." Her breath caught, and for a moment he feared he had made a terrible mistake, that he had misread everything between them. But then she was leaning toward him, her free hand coming up to cup his cheek. "I have been in love with you since that night," she whispered. "Since you gave me your jacket without a second thought. Since you lifted me onto your horse like I weighed nothing and kept me safe all the way to town." He kissed her then, gentle and careful as though she might break. She kissed him back with a passion that surprised and delighted him, her hands sliding into his hair. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, but I do not want to spend another day without you in my life. Marry me, Florence Sanders, and make this house a home again." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in the San Elizario church on the 1st of April, with Mrs. Martinez and half the town in attendance. Florence wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Martinez and the other women had helped her make, and Pierce wore his best suit, the one he had not worn since his father's funeral. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Pierce kissed her with such joy that the congregation erupted in applause. The spring passed in a blur of happiness. Florence moved into the ranch, and together they made plans for the future. She continued to manage the books, which gave Pierce time to focus on the land and the cattle. Under her careful management, they were able to save more money than he ever had before. She also started a small garden behind the house, planting vegetables and flowers, transforming the bare yard into something beautiful. In May, a neighboring rancher mentioned that his daughter needed tutoring to prepare for a teaching certificate exam. Florence agreed to help, and soon she had 3 students coming to the ranch twice a week. She taught them in the front room, which they had converted into a small schoolroom. Pierce would watch her teaching, her face lit up with passion and purpose, and he fell in love with her all over again. One evening in early June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Florence turned to him with a soft smile. "Pierce, I have something to tell you." He took her hand. "What is it?" "I am with child," she said, her voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby." Pierce felt as though his heart might burst. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, feeling the happy tears on his own cheeks. "A baby," he whispered. "Florence, you have given me everything. You have brought joy back into my life, into this place. I love you so much. I love you too, she said against his chest. More than I ever thought possible. The summer arrived in full force, bringing with it long, hot days and warm nights filled with stars. Florence's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though the heat was sometimes difficult for her. Pierce was attentive and careful, making sure she did not overwork herself, taking on extra chores so she could rest. In July, a dust storm swept through the area, one of the worst Pierce had seen in years. He and Florence secured the animals and shuttered the windows, then waited it out in the house. The wind howled and the dust seeped through every crack, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. But Florence turned it into an adventure, making a picnic on the floor of the front room, telling stories and laughing even as the storm raged outside. When it finally passed, they emerged to find the landscape transformed. Everything was covered in dust, and several of the fence posts had been knocked down. It took Pierce 3 days to repair all the damage, but Florence worked beside him as much as he would allow, handing him tools, bringing him water, keeping his spirits up with her presence and her laughter. In August, they received a letter that would change everything once again. It was from the Territorial Education Board. A new school had been built in San Elizario, funded by a wealthy rancher from El Paso whose grandson lived in town. They needed a teacher, and Mrs. Martinez had written to them recommending Florence. "They are offering me the position," Florence said, reading the letter with wide eyes. "They want me to start when the fall term begins in September." "You want to do it?" Pierce asked, though he already knew the answer. He could see the longing in her eyes, the way her hand trembled slightly as she held the letter. "I do," she admitted, "but the baby will be born in February. I do not know if I can teach while I am pregnant, and I would need to take time after the birth." Pierce took the letter from her and read it himself. Then he looked at his wife, at the hope and worry warring in her face. "Write back and tell them you will take the position, but you will need to stop teaching in January and would like to return in the fall after the baby is born. If they agree, you should do it. This is what you came west for, Florence. This is your dream." She threw her arms around him. "Are you sure? What about the bookkeeping? I will manage," he said, kissing her forehead. "You have taught me enough that I can handle the basics. And your happiness is more important to me than perfectly organized ledgers." The Education Board agreed to her terms, and in September, Florence Sanders Crawford became the first teacher of the new San Elizario schoolhouse. She had 23 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old, and she loved every moment of it. Pierce would drive her into town each morning and pick her up each afternoon. And during the ride home, she would tell him everything about her day, about the children's progress, about their challenges and triumphs. Watching her thrive in her role as teacher, seeing the joy and purpose it gave her, made Pierce love her even more deeply. She had not given up her dreams when she married him. Instead, he had helped her achieve them, and in doing so, they had both become more than they could have been alone. In October, one of his cattle fell sick, and Pierce worried it might spread to the rest of the herd. Florence, despite being 5 months pregnant, spent 3 nights in the barn with him, helping him care for the sick animal and monitor the others. Her presence kept him calm. Her practical thinking helped him solve problems he would have struggled with alone, and her unwavering support reminded him that he was not alone anymore, that they were partners in everything. The cow recovered, and the sickness did not spread. Pierce attributed it to Florence's good sense in quarantining the animal immediately, and her insistence on burning all the contaminated hay. She attributed it to Pierce's dedication and hard work. The truth was probably somewhere in between, But what mattered was that they had faced the crisis together and come through stronger. November brought cooler weather and the harvest season. The vegetable garden Florence had planted yielded more than they could eat, so she preserved what she could and sold the rest at the general store. The extra income was modest, but it was something she had created herself, and Pierce could see the pride in her eyes when she added the money to their savings. At Thanksgiving, they invited Mrs. Martinez and several of their neighbors to the ranch for dinner. Florence cooked for days, preparing a feast that filled the house with wonderful smells. Pierce watched her move around the kitchen, her pregnancy now evident in the gentle swell of her belly, and thought about how different his life had been just 1 year ago. Then, he had been alone, eating a simple meal by himself, facing another winter in solitude. Now his home was filled with friends and laughter, and the woman he loved was carrying his child. As December arrived, Florence had to stop teaching. The journey into town had become too uncomfortable, and she was tired more easily. Her students gave her a touching farewell, with several of them crying as they hugged her goodbye. She promised she would return in the fall, and Pierce knew she would keep that promise. The winter was mild compared to the previous year, but they still spent many evenings by the fire, Florence knitting small clothes for the baby while Pierce read aloud from the newspaper or worked on repairing tack. They talked about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about the future they were building together. On a cold night in late January, exactly 1 year after the night Pierce had found Florence on the road, they sat together on the couch, Florence's feet in his lap as he rubbed them gently. She had his old jacket draped over her shoulders, the one he had given her that night. "Do you remember what you were thinking when you saw me?" she asked suddenly. Pierce considered. "I remember thinking you looked like a pile of grain at first," he said honestly, making her laugh. "Then, when I realized you were a person, I just knew I had to help. I did not think about it. I just knew. I thought I was going to die," Florence said softly. "I was so cold I could barely think. When you appeared, I thought maybe I was already dead and you were an angel." "Not much of an angel," Pierce said, smiling. "You were to me," she said. "You are to me. You gave me everything, Pierce. You gave me warmth, safety, a home, a purpose, love. You gave me life. You gave me just as much," he said, his hand moving to rest on her belly, feeling the baby move beneath his palm. "You brought joy back into this house, into my heart. You made me whole again." February arrived with clear, cold days and starry nights. Florence's time was drawing near, and Pierce made sure the midwife, Mrs. Rosa Gutierrez, knew to be ready at a moment's notice. He had made arrangements with their neighbor, Thomas Whitley, to handle the ranch if he needed to be with Florence for an extended period. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Florence went into labor. It was early afternoon, and Pierce had just come in from checking the cattle. She was in the kitchen, her hand on her belly, her face calm but serious. "It is time," she said simply. Pierce sent Thomas's son racing into town for the midwife while he helped Florence to their bedroom. He had never been so scared in his life, but he tried not to let it show. Florence needed him to be strong. The labor was long and difficult. Mrs. Gutierrez arrived within an hour and took charge of the situation with calm efficiency. She sent Pierce out of the room several times, but he always found an excuse to come back, needing to see Florence, to hold her hand, to wipe her forehead with a cool cloth. As night fell and the labor continued, Pierce prayed more fervently than he ever had. He prayed for Florence's safety, for the baby's health, for the strength to be the husband and father they both needed. He thought about that night a year ago, about the frozen woman he had found on the road, about how she had become the center of his entire world. Just after midnight, as February 14th became the 15th, the baby was born. It was a boy, healthy and strong, with a powerful set of lungs that he used to announce his arrival. Mrs. Gutierrez cleaned him quickly and placed him in Florence's arms, and Pierce knelt beside the bed, looking at his wife and son with wonder. "He is perfect," Florence whispered, exhausted but radiant. "Look at him, Pierce. He is perfect." "You are perfect," Pierce said, kissing her forehead gently. "You are so strong, so brave. I am in awe of you." They named him Patrick Henry Crawford after Pierce's father. From the moment he was born, Patrick became the center of their universe. Pierce had never known he could love something so much. This tiny person who was half him and half Florence, who represented everything good and hopeful in their life together. Florence recovered quickly from the birth, and by March, she was back to her normal routine, though now with the added responsibility of caring for Patrick. Mrs. Martinez came out to the ranch several times a week to help and to visit with her godson, as she had agreed to be at the baptism. In April, on their first wedding anniversary, Pierce gave Florence a gift he had been working on for months. It was a rocking chair he had built himself, carved with wildflowers and birds, sanded smooth and polished until it gleamed. She cried when she saw it, and that evening Pierce found her in the nursery, rocking Patrick in the chair, singing softly. He stood in the doorway, watching them, and felt a completeness he had never imagined possible. This was what life was supposed to be. This warmth, this love, this sense of belonging and purpose. Florence had brought all of it into his life just by being herself, by surviving that cold night, by choosing to build a life with him. Spring turned into summer once again, and with it came the anniversary of the night they had met. On a warm June evening, they sat on the porch together, Patrick asleep in his cradle nearby. The sunset was spectacular, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and the air was filled with the scent of Florence's flowers. "Next month I will go back to teaching," Florence said. "Mrs. Martinez has agreed to watch Patrick during the day. Are you sure you are all right with that?" "I am sure," Pierce said, taking her hand. "You are an incredible teacher, Florence. Those children need you. And Patrick will benefit from having a mother who is fulfilled and happy in all aspects of her life." She squeezed his hand. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I think I am the lucky one," Pierce said. "You were the one freezing on the side of the road, and somehow I ended up with everything I ever wanted." She laughed, that beautiful sound he never got tired of hearing. "We found each other. That is all that matters." When fall came, Florence did return to teaching, and she thrived once again in the classroom. Patrick stayed with Mrs. Martinez during the days, and the elderly widow doted on him like he was her own grandchild. In the evenings, they were a family again, with Florence telling stories about her students while Patrick played on a blanket on the floor, and Pierce worked on plans for expanding the ranch. The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work and simple joys. Patrick grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved both books and the outdoors, equally comfortable helping his father with the cattle, or sitting with his mother as she prepared lessons. When he was 3, Florence became pregnant again, and in the spring of 1886 they welcomed a daughter they named Penelope Grace. Penelope was as different from Patrick as night from day. Where he was boisterous and adventurous, she was quiet and thoughtful. But both children were loved fiercely by their parents, and they grew up in a home filled with laughter, learning, and love. The ranch prospered under Pierce and Florence's joint management. They expanded slowly and carefully, never overextending themselves, always planning for the future. Florence continued teaching, becoming a beloved figure in San Elizario, known for her dedication to her students and her innovative teaching methods. Pierce became known as a fair and honest rancher, someone who treated his few employees well, and who was always willing to help a neighbor in need. In 1888, San Elizario got its first bank, and Pierce was asked to serve on the board of directors. He accepted, partly because it was an honor, but mostly because Florence encouraged him to be more involved in the community. She was right, as she usually was. The position brought them into contact with more people, created opportunities for both business and friendship, and made them feel even more rooted in the town that had become their home. One summer evening in 1890, 8 years after that fateful January night, Pierce and Florence sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. Patrick was 8 now, tall for his age and full of energy. Penelope was 4, with her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair. The sun was setting, and the air was warm and sweet with the smell of desert flowers. "Do you ever think about that night?" Florence asked, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "All the time," Pierce admitted. "I think about how close I came to not taking that road, to camping somewhere else for the night. I think about all the little coincidences that had to happen for us to meet. I think about how cold I was," Florence said softly. "How scared. And then I think about seeing you ride up, about the way you did not hesitate, did not ask questions, just helped. I knew right then, even through the cold and fear, that you were someone special. You gave me everything," Pierce said, pulling her close. "Joy, purpose, love, family. You made this house a home. You made me whole." "We made each other whole," Florence corrected, resting her head on his shoulder. "That is how love works. We were both incomplete, both wounded in our own ways, but together we became something more." Patrick ran up to the porch, his face flushed with exertion. "Papa, can we go riding tomorrow? I want to show Penny the creek where the willows grow." "If your mother says it is all right," Pierce said, looking at Florence. "As long as you stay in the shallow parts and your father is with you," Florence said, smiling at her son's enthusiasm. Penelope toddled up behind her brother, her small hand reaching for Florence. "Story, Mama." "In a little while, sweetheart," Florence said, lifting her daughter onto her lap. "Watch the sunset with us first." They sat together as a family, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Pierce felt Florence's hand in his, felt Penelope's small weight against Florence's chest, heard Patrick chattering about something he had seen in the garden. This was everything he had never known he wanted, everything he had been missing during those lonely years after his father died. In the years that followed, their family continued to grow and thrive. In 1892, they welcomed another son, Philip James, who proved to be a perfect blend of his siblings' personalities, adventurous but thoughtful, energetic but kind. Florence took a brief leave from teaching for his birth, but returned the following fall with Mrs. Martinez happily caring for the youngest Crawford. The ranch expanded to 200 acres, then 300. They built a larger house in 1893, though they kept the original structure as a guest house and office. The new house had a proper schoolroom where Florence could prepare lessons and occasionally hold special tutoring sessions, a large kitchen where the family gathered for meals, and enough bedrooms that each child could have their own space. Patrick showed an aptitude for ranching, spending every spare moment with his father, learning about cattle and land management. Penelope, like her mother, loved learning and books, and by the age of 8, she was helping Florence prepare lessons for the younger students. Philip seemed interested in everything, flitting from one passion to another, keeping his parents entertained and occasionally exasperated with his endless questions and experiments. In 1895, tragedy struck the community when a flash flood swept through San Elizario after a sudden thunderstorm. The school building was badly damaged, and several families lost their homes. Pierce and Florence immediately opened their ranch to those who needed shelter, housing 3 families for over a month while repairs were made. Florence organized fundraising efforts to rebuild the school, and Pierce donated both money and labor to the reconstruction. The experience brought the community closer together and cemented the Crawfords' place as pillars of San Elizario society. But it also reminded them of how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could change. That winter, they spent many evenings talking about their blessings, about how lucky they had been, about the importance of cherishing every moment. In 1896, on the 14th anniversary of the night they met, Pierce and Florence took a rare evening alone, leaving the children with Mrs. Martinez in town. They rode out to the spot where he had found her all those years ago, bringing a blanket and a picnic supper. The weather was cold but not nearly as bitter as it had been that January night. They spread the blanket on the ground and sat together, looking at the stars, remembering. "I was so scared that night," Florence said, leaning against Pierce's chest. "I thought my life was over. I thought I had made a terrible mistake coming west, that I was going to die alone in the cold." "Instead, you found your greatest adventure," Pierce said, kissing the top of her head. "Instead, I found you," Florence corrected, "and everything else grew from that. Our love, our family, our life together. All of it started right here with your kindness and your jacket." Pierce wrapped his arms around her more tightly. "I think about that jacket sometimes, about how something so simple, such a small gesture led to all of this." "It was not a small gesture," Florence said firmly. "It was everything. It was warmth when I was freezing. It was hope when I was despairing. It was the first sign that maybe the world was not as cruel as it had seemed, and it came from you." They stayed there until the cold drove them back to their horses. As they rode home under the stars, Pierce thought about the journey they had been on together, about all the moments big and small that had brought them to this point. He thought about the scared, frozen woman he had lifted onto his horse, and the strong, accomplished woman riding beside him now. He thought about how love could transform people, could make them braver and better than they ever thought possible. The children were asleep when they got home, and the house was quiet. Pierce built up the fire while Florence made tea, and they sat together in the front room, just being close, not needing words to communicate what was in their hearts. As the new century approached, the Crawfords' life continued its steady, happy rhythm. Patrick, now a young man of 17, had become indispensable on the ranch and was already courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Penelope, at 13, was talking about becoming a teacher like her mother. Philip, at 7, was still trying to figure out what he wanted to be when he grew up, changing his mind almost weekly. In the spring of 1899, Florence received a letter from the territorial governor, commending her years of service to education and inviting her to speak at a conference in Santa Fe about rural teaching methods. Pierce insisted she go, even though it meant being away from the family for nearly 2 weeks. She returned full of ideas and energy, and over the next year, she helped establish a network of rural teachers throughout southern Texas, sharing resources and strategies. On New Year's Eve, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Crawford family gathered around their fireplace. Pierce and Florence sat together on the couch they had bought when they first built the big house, watching their children and thinking about all that had happened in the nearly 18 years since that cold January night. "What are you thinking about?" Florence asked softly, her head on Pierce's shoulder. "About how you brought joy," Pierce said simply. "That first summer after we met, after that terrible winter, you brought joy to my life, to this ranch, to everything, and you have been bringing it ever since." Florence smiled, taking his hand and bringing it to her lips. "You brought me salvation and I brought you joy. That seems like a fair trade." "More than fair," Pierce said. "I got the better end of the deal." "We both did," Florence said, squeezing his hand. "We both found exactly what we needed in each other." As the years continued to pass, the Crawford family remained close and loving. Patrick married his sweetheart, Maria, in 1901, and they built a house on the far end of the ranch property, planning to eventually take over the operation from Pierce. In 1902, Patrick and Maria welcomed the first Crawford grandchild, a boy they named Pierce after his grandfather. The sight of Pierce holding his grandson for the first time, tears streaming down his weathered face, was something Florence would remember forever. He was 50 years old now, his dark hair streaked with silver, his face lined from years in the sun, but to her, he was still the handsome young cowboy who had given her his jacket without a second thought. Penelope decided to attend the new teacher training college in El Paso in 1903, following in her mother's footsteps. Florence accompanied her to help her get settled, and the two women spent several precious days together, talking about teaching and life and dreams. When Florence returned home, she told Pierce that their daughter reminded her of herself at that age, full of hope and determination, and love for learning. Philip, showing an unexpected talent for numbers and business, began helping his father and brother with the increasingly complex ranch operations. At 12, he was already keeping better books than Pierce ever had, and Florence joked that he had inherited both her mathematical ability and his father's practical common sense. In 1905, Florence retired from teaching after 23 years in the classroom. The school board held a special ceremony in her honor, with former students coming from as far as El Paso and Santa Fe to pay their respects. The schoolhouse was packed, and speaker after speaker rose to talk about how Mrs. Crawford had changed their lives, had believed in them, had taught them not just reading and arithmetic, but how to think and dream and work hard for what they wanted. Pierce sat in the front row, watching his wife receive the accolades she so richly deserved, and he felt his heart swell with pride. She had accomplished so much, had touched so many lives, all while being a devoted wife and mother. She was remarkable, and he knew it even if she would never admit it herself. That summer, they took their first real vacation, traveling to California to see the ocean. They brought Philip with them, leaving the ranch in Patrick's capable hands. Standing on the beach in San Diego, watching the waves roll in, holding hands with Florence while Philip ran up and down the sand, Pierce felt a sense of completion. They had built a good life together, had raised good children, had made a difference in their community. They had done more than survive. They had thrived. As they stood there, Florence turned to him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Pierce asked, confused. "For everything. For saving my life that night, for loving me, for supporting my dreams, for being the best husband and father I could have ever imagined, for making every day an adventure." Pierce pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "You do not need to thank me for any of that. Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done. You made it easy by being yourself, by bringing joy and light and purpose into my life." They returned to San Elizario refreshed and happy, ready to enter the next phase of their lives. Florence threw herself into being a grandmother, spending hours with little Pierce and the new babies that followed. Patrick and Maria had 3 more children over the next few years, and each one brought fresh joy to the family. Penelope graduated from the teacher training college in 1906 and took a position at a new school in Las Cruces, New Mexico. She wrote long letters home, telling her parents about her students and her adventures, and Florence smiled every time she read them, remembering her own early days of teaching. Philip, showing a keen business sense, convinced Pierce and Patrick to invest in a new irrigation system that transformed their grazing land, allowing them to grow hay and significantly increase their cattle capacity. The investment was risky, but it paid off handsomely, making the Crawford Ranch one of the most prosperous in the area. In 1908, on their 26th wedding anniversary, Pierce and Florence renewed their vows in the San Elizario Church, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and friends. They exchanged the same simple promises they had made all those years ago, but now those promises carried the weight of decades of love and partnership, of challenges faced and overcome, of joys shared and multiplied. At the reception, held at the ranch, Patrick stood to make a toast. "My parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "showed me what love looks like. Not the easy, romantic love of novels, though they have that too. But the real love, the hard love, the love that means showing up every day, working together, supporting each other's dreams, raising children, building a life. They showed me that love is not just a feeling but a choice, made over and over again, every single day." Florence cried, and Pierce held her hand, and around them, their family and friends celebrated the love story that had started with a frozen woman on a road and a cowboy with a kind heart. As the years continued, the Crawford family grew and flourished. More grandchildren arrived, bringing noise and chaos and joy to family gatherings. The ranch continued to prosper, providing a good living for both Patrick's family and Pierce and Florence. Penelope eventually married a fellow teacher and brought him back to Texas, settling in El Paso but visiting frequently. Philip took over the business side of the ranch entirely, freeing Pierce to focus on the aspects of ranching he loved most, working with the cattle and the land. In 1912, on the 30th anniversary of the night they met, Pierce and Florence made another pilgrimage to the spot where he had found her. They were both in their 50s now, their hair gray, their faces lined, their bodies not quite as spry as they once were. But the love between them had only deepened with time, enriched by decades of shared experiences, of challenges overcome together, of joys celebrated side by side. 30 years, Florence said wonderingly, standing on the spot where she had once huddled against the cold. 30 years since you saved my life. 30 years since you saved mine, Pierce corrected. I was just existing before you, Florence. You taught me how to live, how to love, how to be happy. She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. We saved each other, she said firmly. That is the truth of it. We were both broken, both alone, both in need of exactly what the other had to give. And we found each other, against all odds, on this lonely stretch of road in the middle of winter. Pierce pulled her close, holding her against his chest the way he had that first night on horseback. I would do it all again, he said. Every hard moment, every struggle, every fear, I would do it all again for one more day with you. We have more than one more day, Florence said, smiling up at him. We have years and years still ahead of us. And they did. They had 15 more years together, years of watching their grandchildren grow, of celebrating births and marriages, of mourning losses and celebrating victories. They had years of sitting on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sun set over the land they had built their life on. They had years of being together, of being in love, of being partners in every sense of the word. Pierce passed away in his sleep in 1927 at the age of 70, with Florence beside him. He went peacefully, a smile on his face, his hand in hers. At his funeral, the church was packed with family and friends, with people whose lives he had touched through his kindness and integrity. Patrick spoke about his father's legacy, about the values he had instilled, about the love he had shown not just to his family but to everyone he met. Florence lived for 5 more years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, spending her days working in her garden and reading to the great-grandchildren who visited frequently. She never remarried, never even considered it. Pierce had been her great love, her partner, the man who had saved her life and then spent decades making that life worth living. She passed away on a warm summer day in 1932, at the age of 72, sitting in the rocking chair Pierce had built for her 50 years earlier. She was found by Penelope, who had come to visit, a smile on her face and a look of peace that suggested she had seen something wonderful in those final moments. At her funeral, held on a beautiful June day, the church was even more packed than it had been for Pierce's service. Former students spoke about the teacher who had changed their lives. Neighbors spoke about the friend who had always been there in times of need. But it was Philip, the youngest child, who captured the essence of his mother's life. "My mother," he said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks, "brought joy. That was her gift. She brought joy to my father when he was alone and lonely. She brought joy to her students, teaching them not just facts but how to find wonder in learning. She brought joy to her children and grandchildren, making us feel loved and valued every single day. And she brought joy to everyone whose life she touched. The world is dimmer without her light, but we are all brighter for having known her." Florence was buried beside Pierce in the San Elizario Cemetery, under a simple headstone that read, Pierce Crawford, 1857–1927, and Florence Sanders Crawford, 1860–1932. Together in life, together in eternity. Beside their names was carved a simple image, a man's jacket draped over a woman's shoulders, and beneath it the words, "When he gave warmth, she brought joy." The ranch continued in the Crawford family for generations, each one telling the story of the cowboy who had given his jacket to a freezing woman, and how that simple act of kindness had grown into a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. The story became part of the family lore, told and retold, a reminder of how one moment of compassion could change everything, of how love could be found in the most unexpected places, of how two broken people could come together and create something beautiful. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled across the Texas plains, the Crawford descendants would sometimes see their children bringing in extra blankets for their siblings, or sharing their warm coats with someone who needed them more. And they would smile, knowing that Pierce and Florence's legacy was not just the ranch or the family name, but the simple lesson they had lived every day of their married life. That love is shown not in grand gestures but in small acts of kindness, in showing up for each other, in choosing again and again to give warmth when someone is cold, to bring joy when life is hard, to be there always through winter and summer, through struggle and celebration, through everything that life brings. Their love story ended, as all love stories must, with death. But in another way, it never ended at all. It lived on in the children they raised, in the students Florence taught, in the neighbors Pierce helped, in the family that continued to gather at the ranch every summer, in the values of kindness and compassion that were passed down through generations. The love between a cowboy and a teacher, born on a frozen Texas road in 1882, continued to ripple outward, touching lives they would never meet, making the world just a little bit warmer, a little bit brighter, a little bit more full of joy.